Assessing Motor Behavior in Infants and Toddlers, a Developmental Systems Perspective. Our presenter today is Tricia Catalino. She's a physical therapist and is a pediatric clinical specialist and works as an associate professor at the School of Physical Therapy in Nevada, where she saw hot air balloons and a beautiful sunrise with this morning, so she can tell us more about that. My name is Maria Maddox. I am one of the consultants with the EI training program, and I will be here to help in the background and fill out any, fix any questions that you may have, kind of facilitate. I apologize, but I am missing one other person's picture up here, and that is Alyssa Jones, and she is also on the background here with us, and will be helping out with any technical issues. Sorry for forgetting the picture, Alyssa. After we are done with our webinar today, you will get an email from the EI training program, and in that email will be a survey that you will need to complete. Once it's an evaluation survey. Once you've completed that survey and sent it back in, you will get an email with your certificate, and that certificate should come in within 24 hours after you complete that survey. So be sure to watch for that email after the webinar is over. Also, if you are observing the webinar as a group and you want to get credit for participating, you will need to make sure that you are getting that unique email as well. So any questions about that, you can text Alyssa or myself. So webinars are awesome, aren't they? I'm sitting in my kitchen right now, moving between task after task, and I didn't have to drive anywhere, and I'm guessing that's probably the benefit for you guys too. But one of the downsides to webinars is I can't see you and you cannot see me. So we need to have ways that we can all participate and stay engaged in the topic at hand. So I'm going to demonstrate or show you a couple of different ways that we ask you to stay, to help out and participate. So the first one I'm going to direct you to is right under your name. So you should have a place where it says participants and then your name. And then there are 4 boxes. The first box, if you click that, that's an emoticon. And that's just something that you can say, hey, you know, we're having a great time. And if you look at my name, I just put a little smiley face next to that. You can scroll up and down and see other people's responses as well. The second one we're not going to worry about so much. But the third one is a hand raise. So rule number 1, turn your phone off. Okay, everybody do that now. The third icon is the hand raise. And every once in a while our presenter may ask you to raise your hand if you've been in a boat recently. Okay, maybe not, but we're gonna, if everyone would just find that little raise hand and push on it. I haven't been on a boat recently, so I guess I'm lying, but there it is. You all found it. Awesome. Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. And if you push on it again, they'll all go back away. Thank you. Awesome. All right. As you can see down below, there is a chat box. So if you have any questions, any strategies that you want to share, any conversations you want to have amongst each other, that's where to do it. So our presenter is going to be asking a lot of different questions throughout, so please respond there. We will also have built-in question breaks, and where any questions that you are posting in the chat box, we will address during those breaks, unless it's something that the presenter wants to address right at that moment. But probably most of your questions will be addressed during the question break, so just be patient. And then as a question does come to mind, please go ahead and type it in so we have it ready for when the break comes. All right, the last way of participating is through a polling function. So that 4th box under your name has a check box in it, and it has a letter in it right now, and you're going to use that to respond to a poll. So we're going to just pull up the first poll so that we can find out who is on our webinar today. So if you will go to that fourth box under your name, open it up, and you should have some choices there, A, B, C, D, or E, and select the appropriate letter that responds to your role, and we will see who all is here on our webinar. We'll give folks a few seconds to find it, and we will get started. Okay. Giving folks a few more seconds. All right, let's see what we have here. So, Tricia, today it looks like over half of our participants are early interventionists, with some CSC staff, a parent or a couple of parents thrown in, and just some others. So that kind of gives you a little bit of the makeup of our participants today. I do have one more poll that I'm going to ask each of you to respond to if you are an early interventionist. So if you are an early interventionist, we are curious as to see what is your primary discipline. So if you would go back to that fourth box under your name, find the poll and respond in that way. And if you don't fit any one of those, put it in the chat box. That way we can kind of see. Okay, thanks, Liza. A licensed clinical social worker. Jennifer is a counselor. Great, awesome. We only had room for 5, so that's why. Okay, awesome. Elizabeth. Okay, give folks a few more seconds. All right, we'll figure that out, Jessica. All right, let's post those results up here. And of our early interventionists, it appears that we have a very good mix of all disciplines represented here today. So, yeah, that's who you've got on your webinar today, Tricia. And at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you have control.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me okay.
I can.
Okay, great. Great. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Tricia Catalino. Thank you so much, Maria, for the wonderful introduction and getting us all kind of started here. It's a true pleasure to be here with you all today. I have my roots in early intervention in Illinois, so I served families in CFC 7 and 11 for most of my career until I moved here to Las Vegas in 2011 to start teaching in a school of physical therapy. So my passion is working with children and families and early intervention, and a lot of my professional work in both teaching and working with the APTA and the Vision for Early Childhood is all around serving the families the best way we can in early intervention. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your continued support of children with disabilities and their families in early intervention in Illinois and wherever else you may be listening from. So today, just to quickly go over our objectives, we're going to be spending some time discussing the developmental systems perspective of infant motor behavior. Obviously, that's the title of the presentation. So really talking more about typical development and really getting into children who might have atypical development or motor delays. We're going to be discussing the process of learning to move and also moving to learn, that interaction of the infant and their environment, and then also talking about some of the research that describes typical development, kind of where we are now in understanding how infants and toddlers figure out how to move. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about there are the concepts of universality and variability in typical motor development. And so I'm wondering, just quickly in the chat box over this slide and the next slide, if you could share your thoughts on this notion of universality as we think about typical development. And what you see here is what we think of is that kind of march through the milestones from an infant to that standing one-year-old toddler, and also even looking at those fine motor skills, and wondering what this conjures up for you when you think of universality of typical development. And looking for some comments in the chat box if you feel so inclined. I'll just be quiet for a second. I know, the teacher is starting with a question right off the bat. How dare I? But okay, so Abby, so can vary widely, yes. Universal but variable, every child is different, yes, of course. So thank you both, Abby and Lauren, and follow the same developmental patterns. So true. So when I think of universality of development, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about too. So we know pretty much that a child is going to need to be able to lift their head and have head control before they're going to be able to sit, and be able to sit really well before they're maybe able to stand, and then standing before walking and so forth. So very good. And it looks like in the comments we're already getting to some ideas about variability. So let's just go to that slide. So then I'm seeing some examples already about variability from lots of people. And so I'm excited to be able to engage in this discussion with all of you. But interestingly, variability in some ways is what we call the hallmark of typical development. So while children definitely kind of move through those milestones, and we expect that they're going to kind of have this universal sequence of getting to walking, if you will, we want infants to practice a myriad of options to move their bodies, choose the optimal mode depending on the task they're trying to do or their environment, and honestly, even their mood. So thinking about how a child might move if they're just playing, right? So they're in a room playing, kind of moving, transitioning from one position to another. Maybe they're on their tummy. Maybe they want to push up into sitting to play with that toy they grabbed when they're on their tummy. Or are they trying to get somewhere really fast? And so you're going to see many different kinds of ways that children move depending on what they're doing, right? Where we worry is the infant who doesn't have all of those wonderful options, who might have a challenge adapting their motor behavior with a changing environment. So like I said, we won't spend a ton of time talking about atypical development, but grounding ourselves in typical development can really help us maybe detect where a child might be having some challenges. So universality and variability, both are true. Okay, so I know it's not the most exciting thing to talk about developmental theories, but we are going to just take a minute to just make sure we're all on the same page with kind of a historical timeline of the theories. And so here you'll see a list of what I hope are familiar theories that we all kind of learned about in our professional degree programs when thinking about child development. And so when we start, I'll briefly talk about each of them. I don't think this will be much new information, but thinking about the neuromaturationist approach is really thinking about that the nervous system is kind of the drives the developmental bus, if you will. They think a lot about the role of primitive reflexes, and that the nervous system is basically responding stereotypically to a stimulus. That's what we think of like a reflex. And the neuromaturationist theory really thinks that, or thought that historically that development was kind of driven by our response to stereotypical, to a stimulus. Then we move to our cognitive behavior theorists, and this is really what we think of as operant conditioning, so development occurring through that interaction of the individual and their environment. And then the cognitive Piagetian theory, thinking that development occurs through that interaction between cognitive and neural structures. So we're starting to see this like hint that we're moving to thinking that it's not just the nervous system driving developmental bus, but understanding that the environment does play a role as well. But they also still believe that our first actions using reflexes then evolve into those voluntary actions. And then the last one I'll discuss on this slide is the motor learning cognitive theory, because we'll talk about dynamical systems in just a minute. But here with motor learning, and I think many of us, for the physical therapist and occupational therapist, and even the other providers who are on the webinar today, we spend a lot of time with motor learning. Like motor learning is learning, right? But it isn't the only thing that's happening when we're talking about development. And so with motor learning cognitive theory, we're really looking at trial and error, lots of practice, and that we have these general motor programs or schemas that are these building blocks of learning and then contribute to development. Okay, so exciting stuff, I know. But we'll move now to talking about what is more current understanding of developmental theory, which is our dynamical systems theory. And this really kind of moves us into the topic today of this developmental systems perspective of motor behavior. So in our dynamical systems theory, we think of development in kind of relative stability to kind of emerging other new movement patterns or even other things that we might see just in development in general, but that this interaction between all the systems, and by systems I mean our nervous system, our cardiopulmonary system, our sensory systems, and systems that include the environment around us, all interact. And while we're experiencing both affordances in our environment and constraints that might be within our body, we kind of develop with all of these systems kind of working and interacting together. Under this umbrella of dynamic systems theory, we have all these other things that are going on that you may have heard of as well. So neuronal group selection theory, which is kind of like Darwinism of our neurons, if you will, the embodied mind concept, which is really thinking about how the brain is plastic and definitely responds to experience and information gained through movement. And then perception action, which is this idea that we have to perceive something to want to act upon it. So all the things that might be in our environment or things we might think we might want to do are kind of that building block for taking an action. And then, of course, ecological theory, which has a lot to do, is much more heavily weighted with this idea of our interaction with the environment. And that here, if you guys, this scheme right here, so Bronfenbrenner's ecological, whoops, let me advance the slide for you. Bronfenbrenner's ecological model with this idea that the child or the individual is kind of in the center, and then we have our microsystem of our family, our school, places where we spend most of our time, especially a very young child, and then moving out into the larger environment. What I love about this graphic is also thinking about time as part of our environmental or ecological experience as well. So as we're growing older, we're also experiencing different things that are happening in a historical perspective as well. Okay, so with all of that, that gets us to this idea of the, sorry everybody, let me just,
sorry, that was for participants because some folks are saying they're having.
Okay, sorry, I was like worried that you guys had missed my stuff, so thank you, Maria, for letting me know. Okay, I got a little nervous there for a minute. I was like, oh no. Okay, all right. Okay, I can get on a roll, so definitely ping me if you guys can't hear me. Okay, so this is really the meat of what I hope we can talk about today, which is this developmental systems perspective. And again, I thought it was important to kind of ground our discussion in the historical notion of theories of development. But there's an amazing issue in an online journal called Wired Cognitive Science, where I pulled this article from Karen Adolph and John Franchak, The Development of Motor Behavior, and then also this introductory article to kind of illustrate this idea of this developmental systems perspective. And I encourage you, these are all free open access articles that are just fascinating when it comes to everything about development and this idea of a developmental systems perspective. So I think Maria is going to be sharing the links to these articles, but then also the whole collection of articles that includes articles not just on Okay, everyone, am I back?
You are back now,
okay.
And you were
Great.
just kind of wrapping up the introduction to these articles.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so sorry about that. So the other thing I just wanted to share is just a little bit about Karen Adolph. And so some of you may be familiar with her work, but she is a developmental psychologist, and she's really devoted her life's work to understanding infant motor behavior. And we're talking about typical development here. But again, all of her writings are open access, and she posts them all to her website for the NYU Infant Action Lab. And if you either Google her name, Karen Adolph, A-D-O-L-P-H, or the NYU Infant Action Lab, all of those resources will pull up. And if you just click on like research, like all of her years, like 20 plus years of research, all of the articles are open access, and we'll be talking about some of them today. So again, just another resource that I encourage you guys to use. Okay, so what I love about the developmental systems perspective is when we're talking about dynamic systems, which is kind of where our theory kind of sits right now when we're talking about typical development, the developmental systems perspective kind of provokes us to think it's not just about the infant developing, it's really thinking that we're influencing each other. And so the environment is changing, the people in the environment are changing, all based on our interactions with each other. And so it's not just the infant who's gaining motor behavior skills, it's also the family who's changing as well. And so really to be thinking about all of these multiple levels, from the molecular level all the way to the behavioral level, and also thinking about how things change over time. So some just beautiful quotes from the introductory article in this series. So thinking that when I was talking about that neuromaturationist theorist saying the nervous system drives the developmental bus, well, here we're saying nobody's really driving the bus. It's more this self-organizing principle that we're kind of all coming together to try and do things as optimally as possible. And I love this idea of sharing this image of a flock of birds. There's no one bird in charge, right? So they're following kind of these simple rules about we have to go in this direction to migrate, but without really instruction from a leader, and it contributes to this organized behavior of the group. And so we may not think, we're making decisions all the time, but the influence of the people around us and the influence of our environment are so strong, but interestingly, very hard to detect. So again, like thinking also about over time, and so I think too, when we think of Bronfenbrenner's model of the ecological theory, we are thinking that the environment is shaping us. Well, we are also shaping the environment. So we are evolving together as this codependent system. So I'm going to show you an image here. And so we have this beautiful, clean living room or rec room or playroom, whatever it is, on the left side of your screen. And then what do you think happened on the right side of your screen? And I'd love to hear from you all. Who was in this room, do you think? Yeah, kids, for sure. Life, I love it. My 3-year-old, I love it. Exactly. So what I love about this picture in terms of illustrating this idea of codependent systems evolving together, something tells me, I don't know this mom, I don't know this family, but something tells me like this neat, tidy living room on the left maybe is their desired state of their environment. But the environment is being influenced by a child or children, or maybe children and adults playing in this environment. But the environment has changed as a result of whoever was there, right? And so it kind of looks like, well, they made a mess of this environment. But I love as I'm seeing, I'm sorry, I can't miss your name. I don't know if that's your last name or your first name, but this engaged in learning, right? And so yes, stuff is going to be influenced as we're learning. And so I love this this illustration of that. So thinking about this notion of codependent systems evolving together, what are some other examples you can think of that are perhaps less obvious than this picture of this mess of a room, right? But what are some other examples less obvious when a child is born into a family, becomes part of a family, and this notion of codependent systems evolving together? What is changing both in the infant and perhaps in the family? I'm wondering if you all could share some ideas about that. Thank you, Aubrey, Emily, and Kara. So there's routines and relationships. So yeah, something tells me that before that infant is born, whether it's the first infant, second, or sixth infant, things are going to change in the life of that family. The relationship with the parents will probably change, and some of these things are going to, again, be very obvious in terms of the mess of this room, but other things much less obvious, things that we aren't even realizing are happening in our routines. Like you used to have your coffee before you read the paper, before you got ready to go to work, and all of a sudden an infant needs to be fed before you have your coffee, all these little things that might change that we aren't even really thinking about. So thank you for all of these. So time management, adults more aware of safety, etc. Yes, I love that. So all of a sudden baby gates appear in a home when children are there. All of a sudden, when we used to easily just walk down a hallway, now we have to climb over a gate. I mean, it's really interesting how all these things start to interact with each other. So thank you so much for sharing those ideas. I think those are all really great. Okay, so just gonna give some other examples of this notion of these codependent systems. So, and as children are learning to move, so as these new motor behaviors emerge, it's all emerging from a mix of all these interacting factors, and sometimes we take them totally for granted that development is happening right before our eyes, and some things we might even miss. And developmental changes in one domain. So today we're talking about the motor domain, can have cascading effects on development in other domains, and sometimes far afield from that original accomplishment. And so those examples I can think of is as soon as a child is, I love the idea of learning to move and then moving to learn. And so all of a sudden, when a child is able to move around their environment, they all of a sudden have a better grasp on object permanence, being able to know that I can go over there and find that thing that I used to be gone. It's just fascinating to me when we see those developmental domains kind of interact. And then moreover, the context in which behavior develops can be very different for individual children, and so resulting in developmental pathways that sometimes converge at the same outcome and sometimes veer off in unique directions. And I think this probably rings true for many of us because we work in the early intervention environment, and even sometimes children in the same family who may not have a diagnosis of a true disability but may depend on their environment and the things that they're able to experience. They all may get to walking, right? But it may look very different depending on the experiences they've had. Okay, so a question for you. So again, under this idea of a context in which behavior develops can be very different for individual children, I'd like us to think, we're going to be thinking on this slide, factors that are external to the nervous system that can influence motor behavior. And the next slide we'll be talking about factors internal to the nervous system. But when you're thinking about factors that can influence motor behavior, what things can you think of external to the nervous system that are influencing the developmental process of motor behavior? Okay, so environment, so I'm seeing limited access to toy books, opportunity, parents, yes. Environment, absolutely, you guys are right on here. So I'll just reveal some things here. So some things maybe we didn't see, but actually the child themselves. So you guys definitely are right on, and I completely expect this because I love, honestly, I think this speaks a lot to our training in early intervention and the level of professionalism in early intervention in Illinois, but really thinking about all of these things. And so hearing about the environment makes me really happy, and the culture and the differences in families. But there are also differences just in the child. So the child's body size, their mass, their height, and even their nutrition are things that are external to the nervous system that can actually have a huge influence on their development. And then all the things that you guys are mentioning here, those cultural differences, task demands, and the environment. So wonderful, thank you. Tina, you're talking about GI issues that can have a major influence as well. So just how the infant is feeling can influence their ability to practice motor skills and really all of their developmental skills. Okay, so now let's talk about things that are intrinsic to the nervous system that influence motor behavior. So what are some ideas there? Drive, love it, Sue. Drive or motivation, right? Sleep, okay. Any other ideas? Yep. Give me the sensory, perfect. You guys are right on. So we think about those cognitive and behavioral factors, so that's where I would put that kind of drive or motivation. And then all these sensory factors, so their ability to actually take in information about their environment using their sensory system, which is intrinsic to the nervous system. So vision, hearing, vestibular, somatosensory, and then again those cognitive and behavioral factors. So all these things are unique to the individual child and their nervous system. And and wonderful. And obviously, you guys have also put in the chat box things that are kind of true about the child themselves if they do have a diagnosed disability or genetic condition. All those things would be intrinsic as well. Okay, great. So we're going to pause here. If there are any questions, you guys have been wonderful in interacting and participating, but I want to make sure I haven't missed anything.
I haven't seen any questions pertaining to the topic at hand come through. So folks, if you have questions, please make sure you type them in so that we can have them ready to go when we have our breaks. Yeah, I'm scanning through. I don't see anything other than technical type.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, no problem. Well, that's perfect because then I'll have a question for you guys. So here you go. So we're going to transition a little bit. So we've been talking about all these things that influence development of motor behavior and some of the theories behind it. And so now I'm just going to we're going to move into more specific information about the development of posture. And then after that, development of locomotion. And so just this simple question, so which of the following components, which of these is necessary for any motor behavior? And so just a quiz.
Go to your, that polling function, which is that fourth box right under your name. It's the, you find your name where it says participants, and then there's your name, and then there are 4 boxes below that. That's the fourth box is the one that you click, and it should open up an option of A, B, or C. So we'll give folks a few minutes to do that. Let's see. I'm still seeing a couple more responses coming through on the polling function. All right. So let me post these results. Overwhelmingly, everyone.
Wonderful. So yes, so thanks you guys. So maybe I could have made this a little tougher, but you guys are so right. So we're going to talk about this in these next few slides, but thank you for participating in that poll. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty then about the development of postural control. Okay, so this is where that one of those early slides where I had the 2 articles kind of posted. I'm pulling that information from Adolph and Franchak, and so this article that was in that special edition of all those online articles, she goes into great detail about these 4 topics: so postural control, locomotion, manual actions, and movements of the face and head. Given our restraints in time today, we're going to focus on postural control and locomotion. But again, I encourage you to pull up that article if you're interested in these other topics as well. Okay, so we're going to start with postural control. And when we're thinking about postural control, there are some things that kind of need to happen. And they're basically, we'll go through each of them, but the first one is kind of overcoming gravity. And so when we're thinking about postural development, it's really this attainment of increasingly kind of upright postures over an increasingly small base of support. So when you're thinking about this child right here, they have their entire, their surface area is pretty wide, right? So they're on their tummy, hands are wide, feet are even kind of wide, they're lifting their head, and these are those, not even the very first efforts at postural control, because this child certainly has good head control, but when you're thinking about increasingly upright postures over an increasingly small base of support, this is that wide base, the widest, because they're literally on their tummy, and trying and lifting the head to look at the toy. But then we can think all the way to an older child who might be dancing on point in ballet, right? Think about a really erect posture on the tiniest base of support, okay? So that's what we're thinking about postural development. And I think these are the most common images we think of in motor development on those milestone charts. Are kind of looking at that orderly age-related march through that series of stages, and we'll look at one of those in a minute. Interestingly, all of these developmental pathways, even though we think about this as a march through postural development, they can differ for individual infants and don't always adhere to that normative sequence, even though that is normative what most kids do. Because depending on caregiving skills, depending on the environment, some kids can acquire skills in a kind of different order. So they might skip a stage or revert back to an earlier form of postural control. And so a lot of this reflects cultural biases, and we found even in some cultures, for example, some infants don't crawl, or they do so even after they learn to walk. And some of that has to do with child-rearing practices, what the infant is allowed to practice, and just their environment. What kind of surface are they moving on the floor? Is it common to have children on the floor? And I'm here to say that milestones are culturally bound. And here in America, we put a lot of importance on stages like crawling on hands and knees, pulling up to stand, and walking, and sitting, I should say. They're very important to us in our culture, and we do give our children lots of time to practice these skills, but it may not be important in other cultures, and I think we do have to be careful sometimes when we're thinking about what is typical for us, and what might be typical for someone in another culture. And generally speaking, I can't talk about postural control without talking about that typical sequence of posture. Does typically that universality we talked about in the very beginning is this head to toe and proximal to distal. So meaning children will get head control before they'll get trunk control, and they'll be able to move their in very gross movements of their arms and legs before they're going to be able to use a very fine pincer grasp, for example, which would be that proximal to distal development of postural control. Okay. So the other piece of postural control, so we have overcoming gravity, but we also have this basis for action. So why in the world would I even want to practice being upright and checking things out? So the stable postural base, so baby learns to push up on their hands on their tummy, or baby learns to sit, all of a sudden opens up all these new possibilities for acquiring knowledge and really acting on the world. So you can imagine that reaching and manual exploration have kind of different developmental trajectories depending on the position that the child is and the amount of control they have in that position. So things look very different depending on the position they're in. So how they might play with a toy would change whether they're laying on their tummy, laying on their back, or whether they've achieved sitting, or frankly standing, right? So if they're on their tummy, it's really hard to explore a toy with two hands because they kind of have to use one arm to hold the chest off the floor while they're using the other hand to kind of grasp an object. And so what do we typically see kids do when they really want to play with this toy? Well, if they can't yet sit, they might roll to their back so they can have this toy in both of their hands. If they can sit, they might push up to sitting because they really want to check out this toy and maybe bang it on something or throw it across the room or whatever it might be. And so this basis for action, this new postural experience in this new position opens up all these different things the child can do using their motor actions, but also all those other domains of development as well. So it's kind of neat to watch and something that I love to think about as children are figuring out what best position to use to really interact with their world. Okay, and then the last part of postural control I want to talk about is the dynamic postural control. So oftentimes we think of you know, it's something dynamic. It must mean they're walking, or it must mean they're crawling. But really, dynamic postural control is this idea, even in any stable position, our bodies are moving. And so this idea of sway, and can we control our bodies even when we're in one position if we have to deal with all the things that are going on in our environment. So even while lying down, the body is in motion. And I think if any of you have spent time observing infants when they're just lying in one position, their body is still really moving a lot. So it's fascinating that they're dealing with all this visual perceptual information, different sounds in their environment, people moving past them that they have to deal with. And so this idea that they can hold themselves up even with a constantly changing information in their environment is what we're talking about here when we're thinking about dynamic postural control. And we'll talk about locomotion in kind of our next section. Okay. And then I just wanted to pull up this kind of classic, as I talked about before, image of what we think of this march through the postural control developmental sequence. And I think we're all familiar with these, but to just point out, too, this wide range of when children might attain some of these postures, and to also think of that idea, again, of the cultural piece of milestones, that the things that are important in one culture might not be important in another culture. And even if we see kids doing things, it may not register for somebody who is living in a very different environment than we are that this is something that is important or not. So just to be thoughtful about that. Okay. So I will, before we go into this last summary of postural control, I saw there was a question from Eliza. If you're familiar with Stephen Porges' polygonal theory, I do not. I'm not familiar with that theory, I will have to admit. So if you have a link or something, I'd love to read about it because it excites me when people are bringing different things to me. So would love to learn more, Eliza, if you wouldn't mind sharing, or I can just Google it would be fine too. If there's anybody else who has questions about that or want to comment, I'd love to hear, but I guess I'm just not the person who would be able to share more about that. Okay. All right, so just to summarize, thank you, Eliza, I appreciate it. Just to summarize then, when we're talking about, excuse me, posture, as we started with our poll question, posture is the core ingredient of motor skill. With no posture control, most motor behaviors are impossible. So really being able to support yourself in a position really makes the next thing you want to do in terms of motor behavior possible. Posture control emerges from the interaction of growing body dealing with the constraints of the physical environment and all the things that are in that environment. And so remembering, too, that the infant's body is changing as they're gaining more control and as they're having to interact with lots of different things, a much more complex environment that they're dealing with as they are getting older and growing. That this cascade of new skills opens up new possibilities for looking, social interactions, manual actions, and locomotion. So being in these different postures, as we talked about, just opens up all these other possibilities for interacting with the world and that cascade of new skills in every other domain, and they're all interacting. And knowing, too, that as a perceptual accomplishment, even while sitting and standing, the body, this dynamic postural control, the body is always slightly swaying, and perception plays a key role in keeping that body inside the base of support. And finally, caregiving practices can speed up or delay postural control and the cascade of new skills that follow. So we know that infants who are growing up in a family that really does a lot of practice of motor skills, and for that matter, any other skills, really encourages those motor skills. So we have to be mindful of that, that caregiving practices play a really key role in all of this. Okay, and our question slide, and so I know that we addressed Eliza's question.
Yeah, we'll give folks a few seconds
any other questions about what we talked about?
Want to post? I didn't see the others. We'll give folks a few minutes, or maybe not minutes. I'm kind of scrolling to see if anybody's typing. So wait, I see a couple people that are typing, so we'll give them a minute or so.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
This is where I need the music. What is it about how hard it is to wait in silence?
I know. Yeah.
Feel like it's boring.
I know, and I always think it is so funny when, when we go to a meeting or go to a conference, there's always someone sitting next to you can maybe chat with a little bit, and in these environments it's always different. So you're like, isn't it out there? So. Yeah.
It is important to be comfortable with the silence. That's right. It definitely is. I need to tell my daughter that. Well, people may still be typing, and we can come back to, oh, here we go. All right. Let's see. Any resources you'd recommend regarding cultural differences in child rearing related to motor development? Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. So Aubrey, Emily, and Kara. So Karen Adolph, so the researcher who we're using a lot of her materials today, is really that person. And so I don't have the titles or the links right off the top of my head, but she did research, like observational research, and looking at caregiving practices of families, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm not going to remember the country, but it was a country in Africa, and looking at the child rearing practices that in some ways it was almost like to see the videos of the moms caring for their infants. For our culture, where we kind of handle our children very gently, like I'm thinking of that first bath experience, right, where we're being very careful, making sure not to get so much water on them, supporting their heads, supporting their arms, and seeing moms really being much more physical with their children, using lots of big movements, not holding so close and supported, and seeing that those infants actually walked earlier, were much more robust in their motor skills in their early months. So I think it's just interesting when we're thinking about child rearing practices, just the expectations in our culture of how we even handle our children, how we hold our children. So I think it's really interesting research, and so I do encourage you to go to that NYU Infant Action Lab and Okay, I'm back.
Okay, so, yeah, you're
sorry,
back.
everyone.
So
Okay, I'm sorry.
NYU Action Lab.
Okay, great. Okay, so again, the NYU Action Lab, she has all of her articles there, and I think it's an article from the 90s that looked at the cultural differences. But the other thing I wanted to mention is we had kind of a very interesting child rearing change in our own country in the late 90s with the Back to Sleep campaign. And we've seen a very different trajectory in infant development while not quantified. So I want to be very careful here. This is anecdotal, but I think many of us who have seen the results of Back to Sleep, while very important for prevention of SIDS, has kind of changed the developmental trajectory of our infants. And so whether bad or good, like, that's not a judgment call, that's just really thinking about how these kinds of cultural changes, whether by policy or practice or just living in a family who's done things a certain way forever, really does affect development of motor behavior. Okay. All right, so thank you for that question. It's excellent.
We had one more question that came through. Can you give examples of how a child might present with significant postural control issues?
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand. So thinking about how you might detect it, that they're having challenges with postural control, that's what I'm interpreting. So if I'm not, please let me know. So I think this is where we do still have to rely on our understanding of typical child development. And even though those milestone charts are culturally bound, it does give us good information if we see that a child is not able to hold up their head by a time that we would expect them to. And so certainly not being able to hold themselves up against gravity in any of those upright postures. So whether it's head control, trunk control, and sitting, and I would even go so far as to say even if an infant is laying on their back and is having challenges keeping their head in midline or bringing their hands together, those things would concern me regarding their ability to progress in their postural control. I hope that helps.
Great. Okay, thanks. So it looks like we can probably move on to the next section. We'll have another chance for questions again, but make sure you type those up as they come to your mind. Thanks.
Yes, great. And I see people sharing resources, which is fantastic. And Pathways is amazing with some great videos for looking at posture. So I recommend that as well. Okay, so we'll now move on to the topic of locomotion. And so what we're not going to, have a slide on reflexes, a slide on whatever, but I'm just kind of like moving you through the discussion here of thinking about reflexes, thinking about how kids are figuring it out, infants and toddlers are figuring it out, this idea of how they're learning to walk and then navigating obstacles. And what I want to make sure we're all clear on is, or I want to be clear on, is locomotion is not just walking. It includes all the ways that infants move from place to place. So this might be rolling, belly crawling, creeping on their hands and knees, even bottom scooting or bear crawling, cruising walking. So any way they're going to move from place to place is what I'm putting under the category of locomotion, okay? Okay, so a question for you all. The stepping reflex is necessary for children to learn to walk. Yes or no?
Well, again, go to that fourth box under your name, and it should have a check box in it. So the check is a yes, the X is a no or false. True is yes, no is false. Fourth box under your name. I see folks are responding. We're getting some good responses in. Keep putting those responses in there. I'm just watching to see when we get vast majority in. So this. Keep saying minutes. Minutes would seem like forever.
I know.
A few more seconds. All right. It looks like we've got most folks have responded. So Most folks have said that is false. No, it's not. But we did have a good number of folks saying yes.
Yeah. So I would honestly expect this. So we're going to talk about this a little bit, and it's kind of, I will admit to you, and I know that people get upset when there are trick questions, but it's kind of a trick question because what we found, and there have been lots and lots of studies, like even within the last 20 years, that have looked at this idea of the stepping reflex, and what the conclusion has been is that it's actually not a reflex. And so if it's not a reflex, it probably isn't part of that being necessary for children to learn to walk. And the reason researchers have kind of landed on the idea that it's not a reflex is when we think about the definition of a reflex, it's that stereotypical response to a stimulus. And so when we think about that very young infant, so that 2-month-old, that we put their feet on the surface and it seems reflexively that they take steps, right? That it's this idea, well, that was the stimulus. That stimulus caused the child to take steps. Well, interestingly, that reflex then seems to go away. And there's a pretty good correlation that reflex goes away when the infant's legs get too heavy for them to lift up. And so they notice that when they put an infant in water, they move their feet or their legs in that kind of reciprocal pattern. And so supposedly the reflex went away, but once put in water, it seems it comes back. So is it really a reflex? The other thing we see is that children do kind of that cycling with their legs when there's no stimulus to their legs. So just free in the air. If they're laying on their back, they might cycle their legs with no stimulus at all. And so if there's no stimulus, it really doesn't fall under the category of a reflex. So it's very interesting when we think about it, and I think it'll take a long time for us to kind of stop using this idea of a stepping reflex. I will admit to you that I use the term all the time, reflexively, if you will, when I'm teaching, and I always have to remind myself that really this is a motor behavior that we see in infants that is basically kinematically equivalent to upright steps and produced by the same muscle activations, but that the children do have some control over it, even in those early ages. And so to just be aware of that. So yes, so it's kind of a trick question, but I think it gets into this idea of kind of talking about what this means in terms of reflexes. Okay, so locomotion, and this is again drawing a lot from this Adolph and Franchak article, but we know that precursor locomotor movements are exhibited during fetal and neonatal periods, but we understand that now that locomotion is not reflexive or hardwired. Rather, it's creative, and infants must learn to control locomotion adaptively. And so they're constantly adapting how they're moving through their environment based on the cues that they're getting, the information they're getting from their environment in interaction with the constraints of their own body. And so I liken this to a very small infant and a very large infant, and the different ways they might try to creep up and down steps might look differently literally because of the size of their bodies, but also they have this task of trying to creep up steps. We also know that locomotion improves with practice, and then practice can lead to extraordinary performance, so amazing things that infants can learn to do by practice alone in the environments where they spend time. Okay, so this is a little kind of looks messy, and it's hard to understand what this is, but so Carrie Adolph did this beautiful study where she observed typically developing infants learning to crawl. And what she found was an amazing variety in all the ways that infants can figure out how to move. And what this image illustrates is all the variations in infants' crawling patterns, and this is of children who are typically developing. So in that left column, you can see all the ways that infants might move. So that army crawl, that kind of inchworm crawl, our standard classic, hands and knees creeping, and that bear crawl where it's hands and feet. And this next kind of column is how in each of those patterns, what are they using to propel themselves forward? So what combination of arms and legs are they using to kind of get forward? And again, these are all the different variations you might see. And so if you look just at the top for the army crawl, arms are pretty important in that army crawl, right? And so in all of these, you're seeing the arms as part of the action for propulsion. But it depended. Some kids used both their right and left legs, some just their right, some just their left. But you will, in the army crawl, but you will notice that most of the limbs were used in the other ways. Then you move over further right and you look at what was used for balance in all these different positions for moving through their environment. And again, each of the marks kind of indicates what limb or what was on the surface to help the infant balance in all these different positions. And while you'll see a great deal of variety are both in the inchworm kind of method, but also in that bear crawl kind of method. And so we know that the standard way that infants move, that creeping on hands and knees, is probably the most common way we see infants move, and it's pretty consistent in using arms, legs, and then hands and knees as how they're balancing. But in all these other methods, it really can vary. And so all of this falls under the category of typical. It's when we see stereotypical movement patterns, so the infant can only move one way, that we get worried. And so this goes back to that variability in movement that we have to pay attention to. And Lauren, I see the general movements as well. I am familiar with the general movements assessment research, and it is fascinating and probably way beyond the scope of this talk, but for those who are interested, oh yeah, from the stepping reflex conversation, yeah, for sure. So it's important still to understand that we want to see the cycling movement of the legs, but the definition of what it is may not fall under reflex, because our definition of reflex is a stimulus that results in a stereotypical action. And if we're seeing the action happen without a stimulus, it really is challenging to categorize it under reflex. So, but thank you, Lauren. And that stuff is awesome. The GMA stuff is awesome. So I encourage people to look at that as well. Okay, so now another example of figuring it out in all the ways that infants approach a challenge in their environment, okay? And so in this research, they looked at infants going down slopes and all the different ways they might choose to go down a slope. And guess what? They go in lots of different ways. And so this is kind of a novel environmental challenge. So there aren't many slopes besides maybe slides that we would encounter at a park or maybe in our home. But going down a slope, infants will choose lots of different ways. And we as adults are like, go backwards, go with your feet down. But because they're trying to figure out this new challenge, they're going to try all different things to try and figure it out. So whether it's crawling down, sitting, going on their tummies, or turning around and going backwards. And so this just really illustrates how amazing infants are at figuring it out. And based on their previous experience, based on how much time they've spent either creeping or moving, and depending on the dimensions of their body, really had a lot to do with what choice they might make. The next row is infants figuring out how to go across a little bridge. And so how fascinating is that too? So not something entirely common that kids might encounter. But again, they chose lots of different methods before they kind of figured out the optimal way to do it. And this really illustrates again, what might you choose the best way to do it? And I like to think about it even with myself. I'm in my office right now and I'm on a chair that's on wheels, and sometimes I want to go reach for something and I might scoot back on my chair on the wheels because it's just much more efficient to do it that way. But other times I might actually have to stand up and go open the door, if you will, because rolling doesn't make any sense at that point. So throughout our life, we're constantly figuring out the ways to do things in an optimal manner, depending on what task we have to achieve and the constraints of our own bodies and the environment. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this idea of learning to walk. So to learn to walk is pretty amazing and beautiful. It requires the sufficient strength and balance to support the body on one leg as the other leg swings forward. I love this image. This infant who's like, should I do it? I don't know. It's an amazing risk and challenge that kids take on to get from place to place. And I find when they're in between that learning to walk and if they've been creeping for a long time, again, just like I'm talking about choosing whether to roll in my chair or stand up, if an infant needs to get somewhere really fast and they haven't yet become proficient in walking, they will likely choose creeping on hands and knees. And it's really hard to convince them otherwise until they've gone through enough practice and built up enough control to choose walking. We know that experience standing, stepping, and moving in an upright position facilitates gains in both strength and balance and accelerates the onset of walking. We've seen this in multiple studies now, both with children who are typically developing and children who have Down syndrome, actually. So practice walking on a treadmill or just practice walking in general accelerates that onset of walking. Practice, practice, practice. And then we also know just a few minutes of daily practice with upright stepping increases the chance of walking weeks earlier than infants who receive only passive exercise. So again, practicing the thing they need to do definitely leads to doing that thing earlier. And I love this, and some of you might be familiar with this already. I make this point very clear when I'm teaching my physical therapy students about pediatric physical therapy and thinking about children with disabilities. But when we're thinking about a children who is typically developing, in 1 hour of free play, which is not that much time, the average toddler takes about 2,400 steps, travels the length of about 8 U.S. football fields, and falls 17 times. And think about all that practice and the number of reps that that child who's typically developing get. And I love this, Nancy. Thank you so much. And we often see in the adult, if we're talking about those influences, your behavior changes because all of a sudden you're following this toddler around. If you go to I always love it when you go to a wedding where kids are there and you see, you know, the new parents with the toddler, and they're just basically following their kid around everywhere. I love it. But anyways, I think this is just really key to understand for our kiddos who are not going through a typical, you know, developmental trajectory. Maybe they have Down syndrome, or maybe they have cerebral palsy, or name any of your conditions that might delay the onset of walking. They may not be getting as much practice, as many reps, to really achieve this robust walking. And so just thinking about that, and Lauren, I agree with you. I love sharing this information with families as well, especially when it comes to falling. Falling is learning. To fall down means to get up, and just think about the extra reps you have to learn to stand along with learning to walk. Okay. So thank you, everybody, for sharing there. Elizabeth, I see about shoes in new walkers. I'm sorry, I do not have a good resource about shoes in new walkers. I anecdotally, in my experience, enjoy having children practice walking without shoes on, but I'm not aware if there's a study of shoes on, shoes off, and who walked earlier. And if there is one, please share it with me, because it would be very interesting. In that study about this 2,400 steps, et cetera, is also on that NYU Infant Action Lab website. Okay, so what happens once we're up and walking? Well, we got to navigate some obstacles, and so this is where we have that perception-action coupling makes locomotion functional. So those early steps, so that previous picture we see of this infant not quite functional yet. I think all of us would agree. But as the infant is practicing and is up and about, you're going to see them have to start navigating obstacles. And this is where they have to start really using all those senses to figure out what do I need to do with my body to be able to navigate through whatever life throws my way. So to navigate the everyday cluttered environment, children must select the appropriate movements and modify them accordingly, whether crawling, walking, or even riding a bicycle. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop there for questions. There's been a lot of action in the chat box. Looks like we got a nice link to that article. Wonderful.
Yeah, so I posted.
Love it. Thank you so much, Lauren.
I posted the link to the. I reposted the link to the original article, and then Lauren has posted some of the details from the study. Let's see. Other than the shoes, can you address Lauren's question about GMA? I'm not seeing any other questions that are coming through, so I think we can probably move on.
No problem. Okay, wonderful. And I super appreciate all the resources everyone is sharing, because I fully admit, like I'm drawing a lot from people who've done more research than me in these areas, but it's really informed my practice and my teaching. And I think just having some of these resources does help when we're explaining things to parents and even deciding when to worry, if you will, and just in general, just increasing our knowledge about typical development, I think enhances our ability to provide services for children who may not be experiencing typical development. Okay, so let's kind of wrap this up and put it all together. This kind of summarizes what we've been talking about locomotion, kind of like I had that summary slide for postural control. But so putting it all together, so again, fetuses and neonates, they produce leg and arm movements that grossly resemble locomotion, but locomotion is not hardwired or reflexive. It's kind of the interaction of lots of things going on all at once. Locomotor development is plastic and responsive to caregiving practices. So when we're seeing children move through their environments in the context of their families or whatever they might be doing, how they move may look very unique to them and their environment, and to be cautious about comparing specifically individual children to individual children, because as some said in the chat box earlier in our discussion, children are individuals and will go through their own individual progress through their milestones. Locomotion is wildly creative. I love this quote. And this really hits home with me when I talk about variability as the hallmark of typical development. It's beautiful and wonderful to watch a child who's learning to move practice lots and lots of ways to do it until they find that optimal way to do it, and then have all these choices of what to use in what context to get the thing done the best way possible. So again, that example is the child playing in a room with toys where they really have their toys around them and can just transition from one position to the other to interact with their toys. Or did they just see mommy go to the kitchen and they want to run after mommy, and so they better get a move on, whether it's creeping on hands and knees or pushing up to stand and running after mommy. So being able to have those choices is really that hallmark of typical development. Every infant discovers a unique solution for their first crawling, walking, bum shuffling, or rolling steps. And again, in the context of all the constraints of the child's body and the affordances in their environment, they will discover that first unique solution that may or may not look like another infant's first unique solution. And also this piece with perception and cognition. And so to be sensitive to this when we're working with children who may have cognitive delays, that the way they might choose to move might look very different based on what they're understanding in their environment and what they're perceiving as things to act upon. So just to be thoughtful about that, that they do find the right solution to suit all those local constraints we just talked about in their everyday cluttered, obstacle-strewn environment. Okay, I have another question slide, and then we'll be wrapping up, everyone.
We are wrapping up. It looks like Lauren had a question about any research on how much asymmetry is normal in typical developing kids.
Yeah, Lauren, I'm also not aware of that research, but I think we all are asymmetrical in some sense of it. I think it's all those contributing factors that I know we look at as physical therapists. So is there tone involved? Is there weakness? Does it match a subjective or objective history to lead us down the road to think that this might not be typical? So I think it's hard to like isolate asymmetry as the only thing I'd be thinking about. I'm guessing you would agree with me as well, Lauren, that I'm just not aware of a study that has looked at that specifically.
And then there is a question about hitch scooting. And just
so hitch scooting I kind of think of as they're kind of on one side of their bottom and might have one hand, that same hand on the surface, and are kind of like pushing off with the opposite foot and using the opposite hand to kind of hitch along. Any other PTs in our group want to chime in on that one? That's kind of how I would think about it. And again, I'm thinking like, and going back to Lauren's question about asymmetry and even this idea of hitching, any one of these movement patterns might be in any child's repertoire of moving, right? And there certainly are lots of anecdotal stories of, you know, look, like in my physical therapy class here at Turo, I often will ask the very first day when we're talking about typical development, how many of them creeped on their hands and knees. And the majority do, but there's always a few who didn't. And so I do think we have to be careful about predicting that things are just going to have the worst outcomes ever if someone doesn't creep on their hands and knees in isolation. But if that happens under a constellation of tons and tons of other things that are concerns, we have to be thoughtful about that too. So I don't think there's an easy answer, but I do think we have to keep things in perspective in context of everything else that is going on with that child and family.
All right. I'm looking through, and I don't see any other questions that have come through. So with that being said, we are going to wrap up our presentation. I want to thank Tricia for great information, a wonderful webinar. We also, in your handout, she also included a list of the references and some of the links that I posted on the chat box. And so you'll have those that you can also refer to as well as some of the other resources that you all shared as well. So thank you so much for that. Just a final reminder, you will get this email from the training program that has your survey. Complete the survey, and then you'll get your certificate. So if you have any problems, any questions, any issues with that, you can always contact the EI training program at eitraining@illinois.edu. And again, Tricia, thank you so much. We really appreciate your participation. And